William Gibson once said, "The future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed." The time has come to draw attention to science fiction stories written all over the planet. Stories made of different languages, colors, shapes, hopes and beliefs. The future happens everywhere. That's why we are here.
Hello everyone, welcome to the second edition of FutureCon. We are very happy to bring to you panels from all over the globe in all possible time schedules. This year, we want to engage with even more native innovators and storytellers that make science fiction happen and flourish in their own language and markets. We want to build the tools that will reshape our own imagination, set up creative networks, and make room for independent voices, crafting publishing alternatives and self-sustainable connections to decolonize the future. We have more than 50 guests from more than 20 countries, showing the natural biodiversity of the future. This year, the theme of the FutureCon got even wider and more inclusive, and thanks to ALCIF, the Chilean SF Association, we could add more networks and skills. I would like to add that the gorgeous video you just watched was made entirely by ALCIF. Our heartfelt thanks to them. Last but not least, the fact that the FutureCon is totally free and panels will be available on YouTube forever. While we don't ask for a ticket, we would appreciate a donation of a free amount of money to support the team. You can donate from $1 to wherever you want. So, without further ado, let's start with our first panel. United Futures of Africa. A whole continent rising to the global conversation. Themes and elements of contemporary science fiction from African countries. I would like to present our participants. First, I'll start with Cheryl S. Ntumy. She's a Ghanaian freelance writer. Her work includes short stories and novels in various genres, as well as news articles and scripts. Her latest novel, They Made Us Blood and Fury, was published in January of this year. Also, Dilman Dila is a writer and filmmaker from Uganda. He was shortlisted for the BSFA Awards 2021, the Nomo Awards the same year, and the Commonwealth Short Story Prize in 2013. His films have won multiple awards, and you can watch them on patreon.com/DilStories. Oghenechovwe Donald Ekpeki is an African writer and editor from Nigeria. He won the Nomo Award for Best Short Story in 2018 and 2020 Horror Writers Association Diversity Grant. He is co-editor of the year's Best African Speculative Fiction Anthology of this year. Mame Bougouma Diene is a Franco-Senegalese American humanitarian living in Brooklyn. He was nominated for 2 Nomo Awards in his debut collection, Dark Moons Rising on a Starless Night, Clash Books, was nominated for 2009 Splatterpunk Award. And Tlotlo Tsamaze is a Botswana writer of fiction, poetry, and architectural articles. Her work has appeared in the Best of World SF1, Futuri Uniti d'Africa, Clark's World, and others. Her short story, Behind Our Irises, was shortlisted for the 2021 Nomo Awards. Finally, I'm Fábio Fernandes. I am your host. I'm a Brazilian writer living in Italy, and wrote the novel back in the USSR and the collections Limitatore and Love on Archaeology. And I co-edited the anthologies We See a Different Future and Solar Punk, Come ho imparato ad amare il futuro. Now, I would like to thank everyone again, and let's start with some questions. I will ask each and every one of you, would you think there are more things in common between African countries than differences? I would like to, please feel free to answer any one of you and to elaborate, and even to correct me. I think this panel would be very good to correct our presuppositions and prejudices about Africa. Please.
Okay, I'll start.
Okay.
Well, Africa, yeah. Well, Africa is has many countries and really has countries that have many cultures, different tribes, and you will note some similarities between some tribes in the sense of maybe the rituals that they perform, ceremonies, their lifestyles, their belief, and even their folklore. And even in that same breath, you'll be able to actually notice some of the differences. And some of these things are vast. For instance, maybe a writer who's a Zulu writer will probably offer a different experience to a Ugandan author, for example. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Sure, Mom, please.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for the question, and it's good to be here, and thank you for the invite to FutureCon. So I think I've been to a bunch of places along the continent, and it's true that you do find a lot of similarities, depending, especially when you look at like sub-regions. West Africa tends to be really culturally integrated, and so on and so forth. But I think just trying to think about it a little bit more broadly. I mean, obviously, that we also got to be mindful that while there's it's also a diverse continent in terms of ethnicity. The north is different from the south. Colonization has came into play and has created a very different patchwork of what the continent is, I think, than what you would have found before. But I mean, just as an author. I tend to find that in Europe there's a lot of similarity between countries. If you go to some parts of Asia, because there's been historical thrusts, there's going to be a lot more similarities that way. I think what becomes interesting is to look at not necessarily. I mean, it's more when it comes to the writing and it comes to the continent, it's to me the similarities are one thing, the differences are one thing, but I think as a writer, what I would be trying to do here is to look at the similarities that we have, even beyond the fact that it's Africa or Asia or Europe. And I think that's probably what the point of this discussion is to look at how we can, as writers, bring out what brings us all together, being from our own individual regions, irregardless of our differences or similarities. I don't know if I'm making much sense. It's 6 a.m, guys, so I'm still trying to get my head around things.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. I would like to jump in. Can I?
Sure,
Okay.
please.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Going off of what Tlotlo and Mame said, there are a lot of similarities. While culturally and ethnically, there's some points where we diverge. Coming much closer to our modern climate, there's a lot more similarities, despite how our cultures might differ. Like there are more common experiences. For example, there's the issue of blackness, which is, a social construct, but it's also very valid. We're sort of the world has decided that we're black people and we are all black people together. So it might come off a bit controversial, but because of that identity, we've been forced or pigeonholed into sharing a whole bunch of similarities that we might not have had ethnically or culturally. It's sort of like, that identity, that shared blackness, wherever it may have come from, however you might look at it as good or bad, valid or invalid, it tends to bring us together. For example, if you look at our current climate, blackness has resulted in a number of things like slavery and colonialism, which has affected a number of other things like our economy. So we tend to be, united or similar in that way. People use phrases like the third world, and yeah, it is one world. Ghana's economy won't be much different from Nigeria, which won't be much different from Kenya, which won't be much. You'll be hard pressed to find, what people would call a superpower. So we have that shared experience. We have that, shared history. We have that shared trauma. And it's not all positive, but it's something that we all have, which in turn it's reflected in a whole lot of other things, our arts, our music, our culture, because social events and experiences shape how humans turn out to be. So that's one thing I wanted to add. It might not be the most positive, but it's something that is valid and it's there, and I feel like it should be acknowledged. So yeah.
So,
Jumping in again. Something that Donald said actually kind of triggered something I was thinking a few years ago. He's talking about the shared history we have and the shared trauma that we have, and me being specifically with my family from Senegal and growing up in Paris, you tend to see, you always see Senegalese people, you always see Malian people because they tend to go to France. You don't meet that many Congolese because they go more to Belgium. So, and going to Africa all the time, going to Senegal all the time, I was always in the Sahel. So even in my mind, there was a very specific construct of what Africa is. Everybody was super tall, super skinny, and it was semi-desertic. The first time I actually saw a lot of grass was in Burkina Faso, driving from Niamey to Ouagadougou to catch a flight, and that was my first time like out of the Sahel region. And there's been a lot more traveling since, and there is a shared history of trauma. There is a shared history of superimposed underdevelopment that kind of resonates the same way across the region. But what really struck me over the course of the years, and I tend to be a cynic when it comes to these kind of things. I tended to say, like, at first travel opens up your mind, and then at some point you realize everybody's the same everywhere. What's the point? But in this instance, when it comes to Africa, I was always looking at, okay, we do have similar problems, but they're not always similar in the same way in every country. And what I found most interesting was native and local approaches to innovation, like what people would use in different countries to make up for a certain issue, how some youth were looking at using technology in very intelligent and different ways, because their environment has pushed their mind into thinking a certain way. So what struck me as super interesting was beyond the similarities, it was the way people were trying to make the best of being shorthanded and just trying to improve things for themselves one bit at a time, without having to look to the outside world, without having to look to a helping hand from the West, thinking, me, I'm this poor little me in a slum somewhere. What can I do to make things better for myself? And I think those kind of variations in positivity are also a very, very important thing, at least in my opinion.
okay. Dilman is trying to talk. I don't know if has the sound. Dilman, please. not sure if he's. Oh, he's out. Okay, he'll return soon. Please, Cheryl, do you want to jump
I,
in?
yeah, please. I think
Sure,
it's really
please.
interesting. Sorry. I think it's a really interesting and complex question, and I mean, definitely, I appreciate everything that's been said so far. I think there are so many ways in which we are similar, or African nations and cultures, have these similarities. But I also feel that, there's so much nuance, with even the areas in which we are the same. There's quite a lot of difference as well. I mean, for instance, you have, countries where people speak the same language, but the way they speak it is so different that you could be from one side of the border and not be able to understand what someone on the other side of the border is saying. And I think sometimes to an outsider, it seems, I think it's easier maybe to sort of amalgamate everything into this homogeneous mass, but there's such distinct little differences, which I think, to me, I mean, as a writer, that's the most interesting thing. When I'm exploring these different nuances, I find that to be really fascinating. To be that there's one aspect of this culture that's so different among this group, but in the other group they're doing something completely different, though they're supposed to have these similar roots. So I think it's a really complex thing in that we're the same, yes. We're different, yes. Our experiences are universal. I think all of this is true. I think it's one of those questions in which there is no wrong answer, really. We are different, we are the same, and we are universal at the same time.
Okay. I want to dive in, just to clarify. When I talked about our shared history and culture, and I wasn't. I understand that there are nuances, and we're different in all these subtle ways. So I just wanted to clarify that I meant that in a sort of in a more general or in a less specific way. Kind of like what it means to. It's kind of like someone who wants freedom. The urge for freedom. There are some emotions that they're sort of more generic. The way that you feel certain things, is universal. Like love, like freedom, like pain, like anger. So yeah, that's. I just wanted to clarify that. Yeah, that's how I meant. That's what I mean about shared experiences. Of course, I agree with Mame, yeah, and yeah, that's when you go into it in depth. Yeah, there are subtle and intricate differences. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Okay. Dilman is experiencing some problems with his mic. We are trying to fix the problem here on this end. Meanwhile, Cristina Jurado has just asked the question that I think that's everything to do with we are talking right now. It's about what is the biggest misconception the rest of the world has on African speculative fiction. Before you answer, I would just want to jump in myself and say that what you've been talking about shared experience and shared trauma, it is awesome because it makes sense. We're talking about Africa being Africa as a unit, being a cultural construct, as Mom said, and I think that leads people to say whatever they want to say about Africa, about Africans, without being able to differentiate between countries. But your fiction particularly has been working with this shared experience and shared trauma. And do you think this please feel free to answer the Christina's question about misconceptions. Does this, and if you can add, if these misconceptions, how can your fiction deconstruct these misconceptions? I'm particularly interested to see what each of you has to say about your own fiction, if you can, please. I'll try to steer things here. Tlotlo, do you want to talk to begin this one?
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think every time that when African authors write, they sort of have to battle the stereotype that they have been forced into. Because sometimes I have seen where people are looking for example, very, very African stories, and some of these people, they don't even know what the African experience is. And one thing that I've also learned is I've also done sensitivity reading for authors who weren't exactly African and set their characters in Africa. And the most common thing is they make these characters very primitive in the way that they act and the way that they speak. They make them appear in a very uneducated manner. And most of these stories sometimes are set in very dilapidated areas. And the thing about allowing also other African authors to show the different diversity in Africa, it allows to show that Africa is not just a barren, dilapidated area, it also has skyscrapers, like beautiful, amazing architecture. So, for example, with some of my writing, I try to show both sides of that and try to get out of that boxing. Yeah.
Okay, Cheryl, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely agree with what Luttra has said about, you know, there tends to be a sort of a preconception that there is only one side to the story, I guess. And I think that's changing now, definitely, as more people are exploring and as more African originated content is available out there. People are now starting to see that it's not just, a mess of poverty and misery, and there are more complicated things going on. But I guess I would say, in terms of my own work, what I try to do really is, more than anything else, reflect my own experience. So, sometimes, I mean, I've had situations, many situations actually, where I have been told that my stories are not a realistic reflection of an African experience, which I find an interesting thing to say to someone who isn't African. But this is the kind of thing that you have where someone will tell you, you'll write your experience and they'll say, well, but I don't know that that's really an African experience, because it's not, there aren't enough barefoot villages in it, there's not enough war. So I think it's really just about us telling our different stories as we know them, and we have so many different stories as Africans that are just completely, from one extreme to the other. So in mine, I really just try and explore my own experiences and my own concerns as a human being within the context of, my culture, or whatever culture it is that I'm depicting it in, because it sometimes moves back and forth between Botswana and Ghana. But just focusing on that particular thing, that particular question of what does it mean to be a human being and to experience the things that all human beings experience within, while living in this particular place. So that I think that makes it more, it becomes less of a National Geographic assignment and more of just a story about a human being having an experience that any other human being could relate to, regardless of where they are. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Yeah, just bouncing off of what Cheryl was saying, I think the question first of who what is African enough, I think is a really
Okay.
potent one. It's a really potent one because it's also a ping pong that is reflected across the diaspora, and I'm diaspora. I'm not. I wasn't. I mean, I'm a Senegalese citizen, but I was born in New York, um, and and so you end up with very, very awkward conversations where people who are born in, KwaZulu Natal but don't happen to be black are considered not African enough for a conversation, even if they were born and raised under apartheid. You're going to have a lot of people who are ignoring, the fact of, the ethnic and historical diversity on the continent to try to reduce it to another element of post-colonial blackness, quote unquote, as opposed to having an authentic identity that is separate from any kind of racial projection into the now. When it comes to my writing, I don't, like sometimes I touch upon stuff that is neo-colonial. I'm not sure I really like that terminology, especially because I feel like it removes a lot of agency from the countries. Like people are allowed to make their own mistakes. It's not necessarily colonialism; it's also you learning and growing. But there's a reflection in some of my stories of what is happening with China and that kind of appropriation. But what I like to do, and it's not necessarily like to do, is just I like to write about things that touch me and that move me a certain way, and then they're just going to inspire something. And it tends to be the lesser explored sides of African issues, but African issues that are African, the problems that we have with patriarchy, the problems that we have, with well, patriarchy, and then of course women's rights, the problems that we have, with child abuse and how we raise our kids, the caste system within our societies. I think I'm not necessarily trying to write for the rest of the world to change their view on Africa. In many ways, I would much rather I would much rather have my stories be able to touch Africans and on issues relating to Africa and things that we need to overcome to get into that modernity that is kind of all these things that are still keeping us back. So I think it's a little bit of both. Addressing the issue of what people consider African in the first place, but then also looking at what defines us and what are our social constructs and how we address them through our writing. All right, so we lost Fabio. So just picking up from that, and while he gets connected, I don't know if we've got Dilman back. If we've got audio for Dilman.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you
Yeah,
loud
we
and
can
clear
hear
now,
you.
brother. Maybe you want to answer this question that Stephanie is asking. That way, and we lost Dilman again.
You lost me.
No, you're back.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Like your screen goes black, and then that little thing starts spinning, and then you're back. But the floor is yours, man, because you haven't had an opportunity to speak yet.
okay, what's the question? Is how have you dealt with how certain? Oh yes, I actually got a rejection later once. I think it was sometime in 2008, 2009, even much earlier probably. I sent it. I remember the magazine was called that where, but the way I formatted the story is was a story set in the colonial time. It had an African person writing a journal, and then the editor said it doesn't feel African because of the journal style, and that's why they rejected it. But of course, put it from the point of view of an African man who realized learned how to read and write from it. And so he was keeping a journal of events that were happening in his village. And they rejected it on those grounds.
There's something.
Okay, awesome. And I'm sorry this time it was I was lost connection for a couple of minutes, but I wanted to jump in with this question by Steph Troth. Sorry. Do you want to
That's what Dilman was answering right now.
please?
Yeah, that's what I was.
Oghenechovwe, do you want to talk?
Oh no, Dilman has the floor. Oh, Dilman, are you there?
Oh,
I
I'm
think-
sorry.
I already explained. I don't know if
Please continue. Sorry, I was cut off, so I lost this.
Okay, yeah, no, I was explaining how I got a story rejected because the person I had written it from the point of view of writing a journal, and this was set in pre-colonial times, or rather around the time about colonialism happening. And the facts of the editor was like, it doesn't think Africa because you've used the journal, the memoir style, like somebody keeping a diary. And of course, at that time, I felt it's weird about it. But the story was later on published by an African American publisher. I don't know if it even raised questions about it being a journal kind of writing. Yeah. That was, I guess, the question was about people being rejected on how they the story. Most of the problems I get with editors, even up to now, in trying to make the story go to the Western audience. So you find like you want the story to be explained, and they'll say like, "Will people get this? Will people get this? Will people understand? Will people understand what you're really talking about? You need to write it, or to either to put a glossary or to italicize words. I've not had that in a while. So most of the time, they take the italicize the word, the non-English word, the past tense appears, but it hasn't been happening. I think it is the problem editors asking for the story, or for elements of the story to be explained to the reader. Yeah.
Jumping back in. I think this is a really interesting question. It's a really interesting question because we're also in a time and space where, and I haven't really read much of his work, so I can't speak to the quality thereof. But there's always the very genuine question of the genuine question of, what about Mike Reznick when we talk about African speculative fiction? And I haven't read his work, obviously, and most of his work, only one of his short stories. And so, there you have, I think, is he North American, Mike Reznick, who really knows Kenya, whose knowledge of Kenya is, and the Kikuyu is clearly really, really astute, and who writes these stories that ride this like fence of is it colonialism? Is it colonial critical? Or is it something else entirely? But I also do our stories get misconstrued? And also, what should we demystify about what African writing is? I think that's a really good question, if only because there's the question of what is African writing, and there's also the question of what is asking for Africans just to be too African, for instance. in the sense that some people are going to tell you, yeah, your story is not African enough. Sometimes the story is too African because the writing is a certain way. And then you're told it's not African enough by someone who's not African, who was telling you, oh, this is too African before. But, there's also this idea that, especially now that there's a focus on Black authors, and there's a focus on African authors by extension, and HBO and all those big channels are busy left and right auctioning off people for screenplays, and Netflix and God knows what else, and it's also pushing African authors into that bubble of otherness that is convenient to a Western audience, to an Asian audience, of comforting people's imaginary in relation to what a continent is and what the people should be writing. I would really like to see, an African author getting a 6-figure book deal to write something that has neither to do with Africa, neither to do with Blackness, and neither to do with immigration to the United States. Just write me a silly YA story about a girl on a pony that turns out to be a unicorn. I don't care. But, don't make it like, the Negro issue. It shouldn't be. So, if there was really an openness towards authors, it would be embracing authors in their diversity as writers, and not necessarily in their cultural bubble as such.
I think it's good you mentioned Reznick, because I tried reading his books and they didn't really. I don't know. There's a bit of noise here. I read his books and they weren't really. I didn't feel engaged with the material. But then one other question I keep asking is, things like Black Panther, are they really African stories? Yeah? Or like if somebody who is not African writes a story set in Africa, do you categorize that as an African story? I don't know, because sometimes it's a question we had earlier today. I was having a conversation with a couple of friends of mine who I'm on a trip with, and we're talking about Ugandan films. And there are some American films that have been made in Uganda, telling Ugandan stories. But the point of view of these films were very much for a Western audience rather than for a Ugandan. And they included things that a Ugandan probably would have handled differently. For example, soldiers here would normally not speak in English, but in some of these films, you find the soldiers speaking English, and that became
Wow. Okay. I think that Mame, you and Dilman really turned the heat up there. So yeah, that was getting really, really interesting. I'm not sure what I have to add to that, but can you guys hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I'll just circle back a bit and talk about things that make it difficult to write from the African perspective when you're publishing, in the Western, society. Okay. Dilman is back.
Oh, I'm back. Can I
Yeah,
finish? Yeah.
of course.
Okay, this app is a bit weird. But yeah, what I was trying to say was, I was giving the example of the conversation I was having with my friends about films made in Uganda by American filmmakers, but they're telling Ugandan stories. The famous one being, of course, The Last King of Scotland, and then there are others, Queen of Katwe and Mississippi Masala. But what the point of view of these films are very much Western. And so even if we recognize the story, there are moments where it reaches and then you're like, but why is the soldier speaking in English and not in Swahili? Because our reality is that soldiers mostly will speak in Swahili first because it's the language of the military. So yeah, when you find somebody who's not African, and that I mean has not grown up on the continent or has no connection to the continent, writing about the continent, does that story become an African story? And I want to say it probably depends on the point of view of the story in a way. There are actually some African stories that I've read that I will say are not African. I know Mom is going to have issues with this, but in the sense that the point of view of the story does not really connect to the continent, does not connect with, like, it's kind of abstract. Yeah?
Can I jump in? Okay.
Yes, please.
I think that there is a bit of danger in trying to categorize stories based on their point of view, because there's a lot of diverse point of views even about one thing. When you say is a story African because it is written by an African, or because it is written about an African or about Africa or in Africa, those categorizations throw up a lot of things. For example, it's like we talked about, it's not monolithic. Different people have different experiences. For example, there's white Africa. There are white people in Africa. There are white Africans. Their point of view is, even if they live in the country, is going to be different from your own.
Yes.
There are black diasporans who can trace their roots, but they do not have the experience that you have. So the problem with that categorization, I'm not saying it's not valid, is that it throws up a lot more questions. Where does that leave other people who are writing from different perspectives but have a certain claim to the continent, but doesn't give them I don't know if to use the word clarity, that people who have lived and grown up on the continent will have, which throws up the problem of legitimacy. Who has legitimacy to tell an African story?
Let me rephrase it. Let me rephrase this. My point of view, I did not mean like if a white African writes a story, then it's not an African story. That's not really what I meant. But imagine a story set in Lagos, but and it's written by a Nigerian writer, it's about Nigerians in Lagos. But when you're describing the characters, you use phrases like, this is an African woman, or you describe skin color. And clearly, the point of view of the person telling the story is not of a Lagosian, because in Lagos, you're not going to be saying African woman, or you'll probably say Igbo woman, you'll probably say Yoruba woman, or something like that. I don't know if that's clarifies.
I understand what you mean. I'm saying that people who fall into the demographics of being African can also, make these mistakes. So I'm saying that is the writing, the way that stories are placed, is that the only thing that that qualifies the stories as African? Because someone who is in the diaspora might make the same mistakes as those American filmmakers, even though they might be, or someone who just hasn't lived in Uganda. So it's a bit of it's a bit complex. So I think that instead of saying what is African, I think that what we should say is, which Africa is it? Which Africa do you have? Which Africa are you telling? Because Africa is, is different fragments and figments of a lot of things, if that makes any sense, It's Africa. Who owns Africa? Africa is it's we say it a lot. It's not a country, it's not monolithic, but it's a lot more true than we know. Even in Africa, there's continentals, there's diasporans, there are different flavors of diasporans. There are diasporans who have never been here, who can trace their roots. There are diasporans who come here but believe they are not resident on the continent. It's I think it's a bit of a complex issue, and we should strive for more acceptance of all the different facets. I think that we should have a more fluid approach, yeah, a less rigid, and that's something that is Westerners especially, because we're mostly all publishing in the West. That's where big publishing is. That's where the big award organizations. That's where the big publishers. You know, I think that these people should have a more broader acceptance of what it means to be African. The African resident is African, the diasporan is African. So it's which Africa is it? It's varied and it's all valid. So yeah, but
It's
of course this doesn't at all negate Mame's point that about non-Africans writing about African, it's not having being told from the perspective of that's definitely valid. I'm not trying to negate that at all. So yeah, this is a separate point.
okay. I would like to see Lotlo and Cheryl jump in the discussion as well, please. I'm very curious to know about Botswana or Ghana and how do this fit in this discussion. Cheryl was saying about Totlo was talking about how do people see Africa as mostly primitive, and Cheryl was also talking about how you see how can you put things about our own cultures. I would like to ask a question very related to this one for you both, for Tlotlo and Cheryl. Then the others can jump in, of course. As do you feel obliged to write only about your very specific particular cultures? Have you ever met a situation which an editor or a friend, someone told you, "Oh, this is not African enough"? As Mom said, you should write about your own culture or your own country, and don't make any big steps outside it. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I feel like Dilman and Oghenechovwe really raised very, very important points. And one thing that I've also realized, because there have also been like some films set in Botswana, and it doesn't fully represent even the Botswana themselves, and especially even in the accent they talk in. And normally what happens is they'll bring other African actors, like South African or from any other African country, who will actually speak in a different dialect and accent to represent those. And I think for some authors, they face a lot of obstacles to basically have the same platform to tell their own stories. Some of the comments that I got for some works that I submitted, for instance, were some editors didn't relate to the characters. They didn't understand why the character did one thing. And the thing about that is certain things that happen in one culture may not be acceptable in another culture. So now because maybe the editor you submitted to is maybe a white American, like obviously they're not gonna be able to relate. And instead of like looking at the whole quality of the work, and the whole experience of the character and the emotions that they're going through, they sort of like invalidate. Now, in some areas, having to write to a Western audience. And another thing that I also realized is some of the comments also come towards structure of the story. One thing that happens back at home is, we have our elders who tell us folklore stories or things that happened to them in the past. And some of these things may have magical realism elements to them, supernatural elements of it. And the thing is, sometimes when I'm having conversations with them, I'm like, why did that thing do that thing to you? Because when you write about these things, the editors will ask you, like, what are the rules of these speculative elements, this world, you know. And sometimes there's like really no answer, and that's how we've always told our stories. So now you have to structure that around certain structures of Western stories. You have to balance it in a way that can sometimes come off as palatable for them. Yeah.
Um,
Cheryl, please.
okay, jumping in here, I guess speaking specifically to the question of being asked to stick to your own specific culture. I mean, I live in Botswana. I grew up in Botswana, but I'm from Ghana. So a lot of my work is set in Botswana, which is, it's obviously not my culture, but I've lived here a long enough time that there are things that I feel are very familiar to me. So I mean, I've always found that kind of a tricky balance. My experience in Botswana has been that nobody has questioned my right to write about Botswana. It's just accepted that, well, I stay here, I've been here for a long time. There's no reason I shouldn't write about Botswana. I think that's also, maybe that speaks to the culture in Botswana generally, that there's a lot less. It's a different environment. It's a kind of environment where um, it's kind of, I'm accepted as a Botswana writer despite not being from Botswana. It's sort of like I've been given an honorary membership, I guess. And so, I'm allowed to do that in a way that I might not be in another culture. I've actually found it a lot harder to write in Ghana than Botswana. I think because I've been here so long that there are things that are a lot more difficult for me to understand from a Ghanaian perspective. So, I mean, I've had experiences where I would write something and it would be sort of well, no, that's not the way that we would do it. It doesn't really, you can tell that this is written by someone who has been outside of Ghana for a long time. And I mean, this is just coming within the African context, from other Africans. But also, there have been experiences where I've been asked to make changes because, I mean, as everybody has mentioned already, because, it's something that people don't understand, or it might not be clear to Western readers what exactly is going on or why this is going on. And what's also said about, these elements of the supernatural and those things, like explaining all that kind of thing to people who are not Africans and don't have that experience. But I mean, I also feel like there should be room, and I mean, I know this is a really controversial subject, but I don't know. I want to just be able to be unencumbered as a writer. I want to be able to just tell a story and not have to be worrying about the political ramifications of the story and whether it fits into whatever little box I'm supposed to fit into. I think there's so much power in what we do as writers, as creative people in general, that it takes away some of that power if you're not able to do things in the way that feels most authentic to you as a writer. And if that means like there was a moment I think earlier on where Mama had said, it would be great to have stories written by Africans that were not about Africa, that were not about, a specific cultural issue. And I think that's something that I really gravitate towards, that it would be great to feel as if we do not require external validation, that it doesn't have to be, it can just be celebrated for what it is without feeling the need to be, to fit into any particular box, nationality or ethnicity or language or anything like that. I think it would be interesting to see what we could come up with if we didn't have to worry about all those restrictions.
Okay. Just sort of just on the side observation. It might be a bit silly, but I just wanted to point out that writing about or not writing about cultural issues deliberately, out of a need to, avoid, you know, fitting into the box is also being influenced by the box, if that's the only
Well, just to add to what Cheryl said, she mentioned
the
something
rationale.
about.
I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
I just thought that. Oh yeah, I'm done. Looks like I went off.
Flo was speaking.
Thank you.
No, just something that Cheryl said, which is quite important about feeling free to write what you want. There are times where you actually sort of feel imprisoned because it's almost like a checkbox that you have to tick. Sometimes you do that because it comes from within yourself, but then sometimes you just really just want to write a story without checking those boxes. Yeah.
Maybe just even to add on that, because of recent, I'm writing a lot of stories which shouldn't even be categorized as African stories. They're just about robots, and they are not set in any place in particular. And I like that. I've been fascinated about robots for a while, and I recently keep writing a lot about them and making a lot of short films about them. Uh, am I still in the show?
I hear
Can you
you.
still hear me?
Yeah, we're here, and we're here. We can hear you. We're just doubting your humanity if you're actually a robot. I think it's off. Yeah, Dilman does write about robots a lot. It makes me wonder sometimes,
Yeah, man.
because a robot would be curious about robots, like a subconscious thing. Uh, his story in the Dominion anthology was shortlisted for the BSFA award, and it has made about 3 years best anthologies, and it's about robots. I know he has submitted another story about robots too, so I don't know. I think it's something that should be looked into.
I think, yeah, we definitely would all gain from a little psychoanalysis. You know what I mean? Like, what is your weird obsession with this stuff?
Okay.
I was just looking at the question that popped up at the bottom of the screen. It disappeared now. Oh, there it is. Have you ever written or encountered a story about an optimistic future of your country, region based on its own culture? I'm just answering for myself. That's a straight up no. I tend to write super, super, super dark stuff, and even though there tends to be a touch of hopefulness sometimes, it tends to just be super dark. I like to see my protagonists go through hell and never make it back. So you won't get that black boy joy much from me. Not that you don't need it, but you won't get it much from me. But the question about Wakanda, I think, is an interesting one. But I think it's not necessarily the right question to ask because you there is no African vision of Wakanda because Africans don't need a Wakanda the same way African Americans need a Wakanda. Um, Wakanda is essentially, basically, first, Black Panther was written by Stan Lee and James Kirby. He wasn't an African American creation at all in the first place. So that it's been reappropriated is one thing, but to think that the vision initially was a black vision would be completely wrong. But understanding what Wakanda represents to a diaspora who needs to identify and find a middle way between the continent that they're from, that they don't know, or that the reality that they're in, you have Wakanda. But Wakanda is not the future of African America. It's bridging the gap between lost African identity and wanting to be a Western American. You don't have that in Africa because there is no need for that in Africa. We don't need to recreate a mythological past and then sublimize it into something that is a grandiose vision of the future we don't have. So it's asking. I understand the impulse behind the question, but I think it's asking the wrong question.
Yeah, maybe if I can add on that, because I'm one of the biggest critics of Wakanda. Like, I really don't like it. Because it's one of the things which I keep asking myself, like, they're calling this an African story, an African superpower, and an African this, an African that. And yet, when you really look into it, Wakanda has nothing to do with Africa. And the way they present the Black Panther is very far from what would have been presented if it was probably written by an African. I don't know if everyone would have written something like that. I wouldn't go into all the problems of that, but it was what I was talking about before I got cut off about calling a story African or not African, regardless of who has written it and where it is set. Because I always think, like, if the point of view of the story is authentic to the continent and is authentic to the people it's representing, then it will be an African story, regardless of who has written it and how they're writing it. So if an African writer writes about a Nigerian woman in Lagos and the point of view is not really of the Nigerian woman in Lagos, I wouldn't call that an African story. I would say it is a story written for the Western market, and which of course it has its own market, but it will be commercialization to just call it an African story because the point of view is totally off. But if you an African writer and you write a story about a robot based on the moon, is that an African story? Because it has nothing to do with Africa. Yeah.
Exactly.
So so the thing with Wakanda is the
Wait,
same
why
thing.
robots?
Why robots?
No,
I don't know.
No.
That's a question I want to answer. Maybe when I'm writing my memoir, I'll be able to answer that question.
I'll look for it.
Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. I might have to break off because I'm traveling and I've kept people standing on the roadside for an hour
Oh.
already. Yeah, and they are looking at me with bad eyes. That's why I'm leaving my shop.
Okay.
I'll probably have to sign out now. But it was an
Safe-
interesting conversation.
Yeah, safe trip. Safe trip.
Thank you.
I hope your trip
Bye,
isn't like
everyone.
it was.
All right, stay safe,
Yeah.
Dilman.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
I just saw I saw a question pop up. It just oh yeah, there it is. Does anybody want to take that on?
Yes. I mean, yeah. I would say, yeah, we definitely need utopias. I mean, utopias are very valid. They're a standard that we improve ourselves just by striving for them. I think that the necessity or the validity of a utopia cannot be overemphasized. It's definitely needed. I've read a lot of I mean, I'm an editor for like several, like half a dozen publications at the moment. So I've definitely read African utopias. I've read some very good ones. and I'm publishing several. So yeah, we do need them. They are valid, and I think that you know the realism of it doesn't even come into it. It doesn't matter how realistic or how possible it is. Just reaching for it in itself is, it gives value. I mean, it's all speculative fiction. What we're doing, it's speculative. It's not real. You know, going to Narnia, going to traveling, time travel, so I don't think that utopias have to fit into the bill of being realistic or being possible. I think that that takes away from the entire point of all this. So yeah, that's my take.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree that there has to be some kind of vision of what people would want to see improve, and I think especially as authors, that's where we come in. If that's what you want to write, obviously you write whatever the hell
Yeah.
you want, first and
Uh,
foremost. But
there's an
there's this one thing that I mean, look, it's a question that comes pretty often, and it was one that I was struggling with recently. We were talking with one of my cousins, and he was like, look, when your father's generation is going to pass, that's going to be a whole, like, a whole chunk of Senegalese history and culture that's going to disappear. Once that older generation is going to go, we are going to be left with a little bit of a vacuum in terms of identity. Um, but at the same time, there's also balancing what is there's this culture, what is traditional versus what people do because they can't afford otherwise. And it's a question that comes up a lot, especially when you have conversations with people who know Africa or who know anywhere for that matter, because it's a travel log. They'll tell you something like, oh my god, people are losing their culture because they're using buggies in the desert and not a camel anymore. And you're looking at them like, yeah, because you lost your culture when you went from a horse to a horse and carriage to a train and to a car. You are still French. You're still English. You're not going to be any less Senegalese or any less Nigerian because you want to make it to the next town over in a couple of hours instead of a couple of days with no water on a camel. And so there has to be that kind of balance between, and I think that's something that we're going to need to really think about, or it more maybe it's a natural process, but there is a generational transition coming our way, and there is the challenge of modernity taking over a lot of values, but also questioning a lot of values that need to change and things that need to progress. Um, so yeah, I don't know if I'm answering the question, if I'm going on a rant right now, but basically that's what I'm trying to say. That there's, it's there is a utopia somewhere in the future, but whether or not I don't know how connected an idea of a utopia is to the transition towards which Africa is going with this passing of the baton in terms of generations.
Okay. Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I posted a link on the chat, private chat. If there's a way to share it with the audience, it's an essay in Fire Lit Mag about it was written by Koin Sola in Nigeria. And it's about the very thing we're talking about, utopias in Africa, how necessary, what the build up should be, accuracy of storytelling. It's one of the most important essays that I've seen written this year that I've read, but it didn't get a lot of interaction when it was posted. So for some reason, I don't know, but I just wish people. So yeah, I posted it. That's just what I wanted to add. You could share it with the audience or maybe on the Twitter or something. So yeah, that's all.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure. I'm done.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely important for us to have those visions, that vision of a future where things are better than they are now. I mean, I think what that looks like is definitely going to differ depending on where you're coming from. I also think that a lot of us are trying to find, ways to move our different countries and our different cultures towards something that could look like that in the real world as well. And maybe that also informs the kind of stories that we tell, or the kind of vision that we have of what the continent could look like 100 years from now, for instance. Yeah, I mean, that being said, I think it's kind of it's an interesting question the way it's posed, because it's, do we need to have them? As in, I don't know if that means, are they necessary for us as a continent, for us to have a sense of optimism, or to have a sense of hope about the future? As in, would we not be able to function without them? Or, I'm not sure if it's asking whether we as writers feel like it's more important to have a positive outlook than a negative one. Because I mean, I think there's also definitely a place for those darker stories, for those dystopian stories. I mean, I like a happy ending personally, but I do think that those stories can be really powerful. And sometimes we also need to have that, to look at what could go terribly, terribly wrong if we just don't get things right, if we don't get things together. So yeah, I was just, throwing that out there. Whether this is something directed to us as writers, whether there's one path is better than the other, or whether it's just a general question. Okay, I feel like I'm just rambling now, so I'm going to stop.
Okay, I'll just jump in there and say that yeah, I think that generally Africans tend to favor the dark, or the problematic, or the traumatic, because I mean everybody has a larger experience that informs them. And while people write utopias, people write black joy, people write trauma, I think that the trauma that we write is more and is stronger, and there's a reason behind it. But despite this, there's still other things. People still write utopias, people still write joy. And I'm going to circle back to what I said earlier about which Africa is it? It's all valid, you know, even if more of us connect with, the dark, I think that people should just learn to embrace Africa as not being monolithic, as being, you know, a combination of a whole lot of different things, patches of darkness, light, happiness, trauma, everything, So I think that we should just learn to, not just us, but, the rest of the world that receives our work, publishers, editors, consumers, should learn to understand that no one thing is Africa. There's a lot of Africa. So, you should just pick what you can identify with, what you want. If you want Black Boy Joy, go with it. If you want something critical of colonialism, if you want to write about queerness or read about queerness, it's all, we should learn to stop pigeonholing or defining Africa so closely, or gatekeeping and censoring and all that. So, yeah.
Guys, sorry, I didn't realize. Okay, yeah. Well, Francesco's back. I just saw that they were pushing us for final remarks.
Okay.
Warmed this up.
Do
Francesco,
you,
over to you.
do you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes. Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yeah, we do.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, guys, because we had we had some problems with connections and Fabio.
Yeah, Italy, Uganda, same deal apparently. Look, I really have nothing much to add. Personally, I think that what Oghenechovwe was saying is pretty much it. You know, there's not one Africa. There's many. I mean, it's ironic that this panel is also called the United Future of Africa, and that we would conclude with someone saying, "Well, there's multiple Africas. Pick the one you can relate to, and maybe try to learn about the others." But I think that's the lesson here. You know, just you're thinking Africa, don't think Africa as this is Africa. Think, you know, keep your mind open and embrace the diversity. Anybody else? No? All right. Well, I will pick up moderation for this, guys. Thank you for taking the time. FutureCon, thank you so much. I hope we get to the bottom of Dilman's obsession with robots one of these days. And yeah, seriously, what is up with him and robots? Guys, it was great talking to you, and I really hope we get to do this again.
Thank you.
Same here.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
It was a great
Yeah, bye.
conversation.
Take care, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
William Gibson once said, "The future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed." The time has come to draw attention to science fiction stories written all over the planet. Stories made of different languages, colors, shapes, hopes, and beliefs. The future happens everywhere. That's why we are here.